Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast. If you've been listening to me, you know that I've long been fascinated with many things such as the silk and spice trade routes. And I have said many times on this podcast that I believe that those traders that were out there trading on those silk and spice routes so many years ago were really the true adventurers, because what an adventure that must have been. They were gone for years at a time. They didn't know whether they would live or die. They were going through extreme weather. They were having a hard, learning to communicate, learning to get your way around, where you really didn't know where you were going and you just kind of were walking along the way. It must have been quite the adventure and quite the time. In fact, Marco Polo, who was quite famous and known for his Silk Road travels, he wrote in the 1200s, when he set out on the Silk Road, he said this: "There is a marvelous thing related to the desert, which is when travelers are on the move by night, and one of them chances to lag behind or fall asleep. When he tries to gain his company again, he will hear spirits talking and will suppose them to be his own comrades. Sometimes the spirits will call him by name, and thus shall a traveler ofttimes be led astray, so that he never finds his party. Sometimes the stray traveler will hear, as it were, the tramp and hum of great avalanches of people away from the real line of roads, and taking this to be their own company, they will follow the sound, and when day breaks, find that on a cheat has been put on them, and they are in an ill plight. Even in the daytime, one hears these spirits talking, and sometimes you hear the sound of a variety of musical instruments, and still more commonly the sound of drums. Hence, in making this journey, it's customary for travelers to keep close together, all the animals to have belts at their neck, so they cannot easily get astray. And at sleeping time, a signal is put to show the direction of the next march. So thus it is, the desert is crossed." And I really love that, because it really shows how treacherous it was to cross these deserts, where these people that were on the Silk Road or on the Spice Road to cross, that how if you just fell behind the trail, you probably died. How you would, be led astray through other voices and find yourself in a predicament or problems, or how maybe you couldn't see very much ahead of you. That all of these things that these travelers went through for the Silk Road or for the Spice Road. So I personally myself, I really take my hat off to those travelers that were on the ancient silk and spice routes. But not only did they do these routes, but they also had a huge cultural impact when they traveled these routes together. So let's talk a bit about the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road was a network of trade routes that span over 4,000 miles. You think of that for a minute, 4,000 miles. It connected China with the Mediterranean, passing through Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East. It began during the Han Dynasty, and it began to facilitate the trade of goods, ideas, and innovation for centuries. It was the exchange beyond goods, that it wasn't just a silk route about good, it was also became a cultural bridge. Chinese silk became prized for its texture and elegance in Rome. But yet there were, things, the merchants, travelers, and scholars and others had other things that the Chinese wanted. So it became this valuable exchange, or this valuable cultural exchange. Things such as artistic techniques began to be exchanged. Music and performance, musical instruments. The Chinese flute, originated from a Persian instrument introduced via the Silk Road. Cuisine, foods such as noodles, which, noodles is a very important part of Chinese cuisine, and certain spices made their way from the east to the west, impacting culinary traditions on both sides. The blending of ingredients, new dishes that reflected a fusion of culture. Just think, where would Italy be today if Italy didn't have the noodles, that they got from the east? Religion too, including Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, all began to make their way, into these other parts of the world. The spice route connected Southeast Asia, India, Middle East, and Europe, and was an essential trade route for things like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and black pepper. And spices became very valuable commodities during the spice trading. They became symbols of wealth. They began to change the cuisine of many of these countries and places. They were important for medicine. They were important for preservation. They were important for religious rituals. So, the spice route changed the cuisine and the cooking methods. They began to transform them. Indian spices as black pepper and cardamom found its way to Middle Eastern and Mediterranean dishes, began to enrich their flavor and their taste. Were used very important in medicine or medicinal purposes. Some of these spices were traded back and forth. And they became known to be important parts of festivals and traditions. The spices were brought, things such as saffron became very important. I know, even for cardamom is very important up in Sweden for some of the rolls that they make during, especially the holiday season, the Christmas time. They use cardamom and put cardamom in the rolls. And so, it even made its way up into Northern Europe. Language and literature was another thing which became, words and language changed. There became a shared architecture and artistic tradition where, there was Islamic and Persian influences can be seen in architecture and throughout the world where these routes took place. The spread of arts and crafts, the different techniques that would go from one part to another, which people held on to and became a very important part. There became trade languages. Silk Road began to develop several trade dialects that became incorporated elements of Persian, Arabic, Chinese, and Turkish languages. So they began to speak sort of like this, a different type of language. It, changed the sciences and the cultural exchanges. Cities became cosmopolitan. They became like these melting pots of these different cultures, all came together. An example would be modern day Istanbul, which is known as Constantinople, became the sort of melting pot between the East and West because of these trade routes. These cities began to merge, become somewhere between these cultures almost. They became, the societies changed. There was a spread of religion and philosophy that began to change, where religion began to, especially, Buddhism began to spread throughout Asia and other parts of the world, Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. So they had the influence on a lot of these local traditions. Food and a lot of festivals are from these old trade routes. If you're going to look at two trade routes that really impacted the world in many different ways, it would definitely be the Silk Road and the spice trade routes, were two of the trade routes which really had a great impact on the world itself. If you'd like to be able to learn more about this, I've written a blog post on it called The Cultural Impact of Ancient Silk and Spice Routes. And we'll put a link in the description below to that blog post where you can be able to read more. But I really love that quote that I read at the beginning about that Marco Polo wrote about it, because I think when we think about these trade routes, or if you go out to one of these deserts where you're lucky enough to go into the deserts, which I have, and you get out there and you just realize what a vast place this is, and you wonder, how were these people able to traverse on these deserts? If the wind blows up, the sand comes, how many people have been lost there? And how many people died on these routes itself? I don't know. The number must be phenomenal. But like Marco Polo said, people would just be led astray because they couldn't see in front of them, or they fell asleep, or their animal wandered off. And it really makes me have a great, appreciation for these explorers during this time that were really willing to live their life as a global citizen. We talk about that in our Dusty Roads podcast and in our blog, A Bus on a Dusty Road. But really, truly, some of these explorers on these routes, these unknown men, mainly men, I don't know how many women there were, but these unknown individuals that were on these trade routes, that were willing to risk their life and risk everything to be able to live their life as a global citizen. I take my hat off to them and I admire them. Thank you so much for listening. We sure do appreciate you, our listeners, and we appreciate you being part of our community. We hope you'll subscribe and join with us. Thank you.